A racist boss humiliates Malcolm, a quiet but brilliant black employee, in front of the entire team. Little does he know, Malcolm is silently plotting his revenge, a calculated move that will expose his corruption and shock everyone, bringing down the boss's entire career in one fell swoop. Before we jump into this powerful story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, whether it's your home, office, or somewhere unexpected. We'd love to hear from you. Malcolm sat quietly in his corner of the conference room, his pen poised over a notepad, as he listened to the usual chatter of the weekly team meeting. Around the long glass table, his colleagues exchanged ideas, reports, and the occasional joke, except for Greg. Greg, the team leader and senior manager, had a different presence. Greg's sharp, commanding voice usually dominated the room, and today, like most days, Malcolm knew it would eventually turn toward him. Sure enough, as the team shifted focus to the latest quarterly report, Greg's eyes narrowed as they landed on Malcolm. "Malcolm, can you explain these figures?" Greg's voice carried a thinly veiled layer of disdain, the kind Malcolm had grown used to over the years. Malcolm looked up from his notes, ready to explain his section of the report, which he had meticulously prepared. But before he could get a word in, Greg cut him off with a smirk. "Actually, never mind. I'm not sure you'd understand it yourself. You're more comfortable with basic tasks, right?" A chuckle rippled across the room. It was subtle, but it was enough to send a wave of discomfort through the air. Malcolm felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up his neck, but he remained silent, his expression neutral. He had learned over time how to keep his emotions in check, especially when dealing with someone like Greg. "See, everyone," Greg continued, leaning back in his chair. "This is why I always say we need to ensure that people are really qualified for these positions. It's not enough to just fill a quota. You need actual talent." His eyes flicked over to Malcolm, lingering for a second too long. Malcolm could feel the weight of his colleagues' eyes on him, the awkward silence that followed. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared at their laptops, unwilling to meet his gaze. Greg's words weren't just an attack on Malcolm's performance. They were an attack on his very presence in the room, on the idea that he even deserved to be there. He wanted to respond. He wanted to stand up, call out Greg for his thinly veiled racism, for the daily microaggressions that had become a pattern. But Malcolm knew this wasn't the moment. Not yet. Instead, he swallowed his pride and nodded curtly, turning his attention back to his notepad as Greg moved on, satisfied with the blow he'd landed. But Malcolm wasn't going to forget this. He wasn't going to let it slide this time. There was something about today, something in the way Greg had crossed that invisible line from passive aggression to open disrespect. It stirred something deep within Malcolm, something that had been simmering for a long time. As the meeting dragged on, Malcolm remained outwardly calm, though his mind raced with thoughts of the subtle injustices he had faced since joining the company. This wasn't the first time Greg had publicly humiliated him, but today felt different. The dismissive tone, the laughter from his colleagues, small perhaps, but it stung deeper than usual. Malcolm knew this wasn't just about his work. It was about something more ingrained, more systemic. After the meeting ended, Malcolm quietly gathered his things and made his way back to his desk, his face impassive. His phone buzzed with messages from a couple of colleagues expressing their discomfort with what had happened, but no one had said anything during the meeting. They never did. It was easier for them to stay quiet, to avoid confrontation, to let Greg's behavior slide because, after all, it wasn't their problem. Malcolm sat down, his mind churning with ideas and plans. He wasn't someone who reacted impulsively. Over the years, he had learned the power of patience. He had also learned that revenge wasn't about losing control. It was about gaining it. And today, Greg had handed him an opportunity. Malcolm's gaze moved over the office, the rows of desks, the quiet murmur of colleagues typing away, unaware of what was now brewing in his mind. He knew there were ways to fight back. Smart, calculated ways. He had seen enough in his time at the company to know that Greg wasn't as untouchable as he liked to think. There were cracks in his armor, vulnerabilities Malcolm could exploit. And Malcolm, always observant, had noticed every single one. He leaned back in his chair, pulling up a few documents on his computer. Over the next few days, Malcolm would quietly gather his evidence. He would move carefully, make sure every piece was in place before he acted. This wasn't about a quick fix. This was about making sure Greg felt the weight of his own arrogance, and not just for a moment, but in a way that would echo far beyond this office. Malcolm's plan wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be obvious. But it was going to be devastating. Malcolm spent the next few days in quiet observation, his calm exterior masking the determination that burned within him. He knew Greg's weaknesses weren't just his arrogance and thinly veiled racism. There were bigger flaws at play, ones that could ruin a man in Greg's position. Malcolm just needed to find the right pressure points to expose them. He started subtly, asking around, speaking with a few trusted colleagues over casual coffee breaks. People were more willing to talk than he expected, especially when the subject wasn't directly about Greg. He learned that Greg had a reputation, not just for his microaggressions, but for pushing ethical boundaries, especially when it came to the company's financial dealings. There had been whispers for a while, but no one had concrete proof. Still, where there was smoke, there was fire. Malcolm sifted through old emails, cross-referenced data from the last few projects Greg had overseen, and began to see a pattern. Small discrepancies in the financial reports, nothing huge, but enough to suggest something wasn't quite right. Greg had been playing fast and loose with the numbers, likely skimming off the top of company projects for personal gain. It wasn't obvious at first, but Malcolm's meticulous nature allowed him to piece together the puzzle. There was a certain satisfaction in the quiet work of pulling Greg's world apart, piece by piece. Malcolm didn't need to shout or make grand gestures. He was building his case, slowly, methodically. Every late night spent gathering evidence brought him closer to his goal. But Malcolm wasn't done yet. He needed more than just financial missteps to bring Greg down. Greg's position in the company was too entrenched to be undone by a few discrepancies. He needed something bigger, something that would force the higher-ups to act. And then it came to him. The company's hiring policies. He had long suspected that Greg was behind the subtle but consistent sidelining of minority candidates. Though the company prided itself on its diversity initiatives, Malcolm knew from experience that the reality was often very different. He had heard stories of talented individuals, especially from minority backgrounds, being passed over for promotions or simply not hired. Greg's influence in the hiring process was stronger than many realized, and Malcolm was certain that a deeper investigation would reveal how Greg had manipulated the system to keep certain people out. Malcolm made a few discreet inquiries, searching for hiring records, performance reviews, and internal memos. As expected, his instincts were right. The records were damning. Minority candidates had been consistently overlooked, and in some cases, their files had been tampered with. All signs pointed to Greg, and with that, Malcolm had the final piece he needed. Now that he had the evidence, Malcolm had to decide how to act. His goal wasn't just to expose Greg's wrongdoing. It was to do so in a way that would have lasting consequences, not just for Greg, but for the entire company. He wanted to send a message, one that would ripple through the organization and beyond. He began by planting seeds in the right places. He spoke to a few colleagues, trusted individuals who had also experienced Greg's behavior, although theirs had been less blatant than what Malcolm had endured. Slowly, word began to spread that something was brewing, though no one quite knew what. Malcolm wasn't going to make his move alone. He reached out to Sarah, a senior executive he had worked with on a few projects. Sarah was known for her no-nonsense approach and had little patience for the company's internal politics. She had been one of the few people in the office who treated Malcolm with genuine respect. He carefully laid out what he had discovered, showing her the financial discrepancies and the evidence of discriminatory hiring practices. Sarah was stunned. "How long have you known about this?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes wide as she scanned through the documents. "A while," Malcolm replied evenly, "but I needed to be sure. And I needed to be careful." Sarah leaned back in her chair, still processing the weight of what Malcolm had brought to her. "This could ruin Greg. Hell, this could shake the whole company." Malcolm nodded. "That's the idea." Sarah looked at him, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "You've thought this through, but this "This is going to cause waves. I'm counting on it," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "Greg thinks he's untouchable, but he's not, and it's time someone showed him that." Sarah agreed to help, though she warned Malcolm that there could be blowback. But Malcolm was prepared for whatever came his way. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for every person who had ever been sidelined or humiliated by someone like Greg. Together, they devised a plan. Sarah would take the financial discrepancies and the discriminatory hiring practices directly to the board of directors. With Sarah's seniority and credibility, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. Meanwhile, Malcolm would remain in the background, quietly gathering more evidence and preparing for the fallout. As the days passed, Malcolm's anticipation grew. He kept his usual routine at work, pretending nothing was out of the ordinary, while the pieces of his plan fell into place. He knew it was only a matter of time before Greg's world came crashing down, and when it did, everyone would know exactly who was responsible. It was a typical Monday morning when Greg strolled into the office, his usual swagger on full display. Unbeknownst to him, this was the beginning of the end. As he settled into his office, his phone buzzed with a message from HR, requesting a meeting later that day. Greg barely glanced at it, assuming it was some routine matter. He had no idea what was coming. Across the office, Malcolm sat at his desk, a quiet sense of satisfaction washing over him. He knew that this was the day everything would start to unravel. Sarah had delivered the evidence to the board late last week, and the wheels were already in motion. The financial discrepancies, the hiring practices, it was all being reviewed at the highest levels of the company. Greg's carefully constructed facade of power and control was about to be shattered. By mid-afternoon, rumors had begun to circulate. Something big was happening, but no one seemed to know the full story. Greg, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing around him, went about his day as usual, barking orders and cracking jokes with his inner circle. He had no reason to suspect that Malcolm, the quiet, diligent employee he had humiliated time and time again, had orchestrated the entire thing. Later that day, Greg was called into the HR meeting. As he walked down the hallway toward the conference room, he sensed something was off. The atmosphere was different, tense, as if the usual office buzz had quieted down in anticipation of something. But Greg brushed it off. He had faced tough meetings before. He always came out on top. When Greg entered the room, he was greeted not only by HR but by a few members of the board of directors as well. Sarah was there too, her expression unreadable. Greg's confidence wavered for the first time. This wasn't a routine meeting. "Greg, we need to talk about some serious issues that have come to our attention," the head of HR began, her tone cold and professional. "We've been reviewing certain financial documents, as well as recent hiring decisions made under your supervision." Greg's face paled. "What are you talking about?" One of the board members slid a file across the table toward him. "We found significant irregularities in your handling of project funds, as well as discriminatory patterns in the hiring and promotion process. This is very serious." Greg's heart pounded in his chest. How could they have found out? He had been careful, or so he thought. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a defense. But before he could speak, Sarah chimed in. "We've also reviewed performance reports and internal memos from the last year," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The evidence is clear, Greg. You've been manipulating the system for your own benefit and to keep certain people out." Greg's mouth went dry. He looked around the room, his mind desperately searching for a way out. But there was none. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his career, he realized that his position, his reputation, everything he had worked for, was in jeopardy. Greg tried to maintain his composure, but his voice faltered as he spoke. This must be some kind of misunderstanding. I've always acted in the company's best interests." But the board wasn't buying it. "We've already conducted a preliminary investigation," one of the directors said firmly. "There's enough evidence here to warrant further action. We're considering our options, but this isn't going away." Greg's mind spun. How had this happened? Who had done this? And then it hit him. Malcolm. It had to be him. The timing was too perfect. The humiliation in the meeting too fresh. Greg had always dismissed Malcolm, seen him as insignificant. But now, as the pieces began to fall into place, Greg realized that he had underestimated him. Malcolm, Greg muttered under his breath. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What about Malcolm? Greg's eyes darkened. This has his fingerprints all over it. He's the one behind this, isn't he? Sarah remained silent, her expression giving nothing away, but the silence was enough. Greg knew the truth now, and it enraged him. He had been outplayed by the very person he had thought was beneath him. The irony of it all twisted inside him like a knife. I want to talk to him, Greg demanded, his voice rising. Now. But the board was done entertaining his demands. That won't be necessary, the head of HR said. You'll be placed on administrative leave while we continue the investigation. Please gather your things. Greg stood there, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had always been the one in control, the one who humiliated others. Now it was his turn to face public disgrace, and the worst part of it all? Malcolm had done it without ever raising his voice. As Greg stormed out of the office, heads turned, whispers followed him. The once untouchable boss was now the subject of gossip and speculation. He had been humiliated in front of the entire company, and everyone knew it. Back at his desk, Malcolm watched as Greg's figure disappeared down the hallway. His expression remained calm, but inside, he felt a quiet sense of justice. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. It was about righting a wrong. Greg had spent years abusing his power, and now, for the first time, he was facing the consequences. And yet, Malcolm knew this was just the beginning. The investigation would continue, and the truth would come out. But for now, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had played his cards perfectly, and the first step of his plan had unfolded just as he had intended. The news of Greg's suspension spread quickly through the office. Within hours, whispers and murmurs filled the hallways, break rooms, and online chats. Some people were shocked, others relieved, and a few had seen it coming for a long time. But one thing was certain. Greg's downfall was the topic on everyone's mind. Malcolm kept a low profile, continuing his work as usual, though the atmosphere around him had shifted. Colleagues who had once kept their distance now approached him, quietly offering words of support, or simply acknowledging him in ways they hadn't before. It was clear that the office dynamic was changing, though Malcolm wasn't one to bask in the attention. He hadn't done this for validation. His focus remained on ensuring that Greg would face the full consequences of his actions. A few days after Greg's departure, HR and the board of directors reached out to Malcolm for a formal discussion. They wanted more insight into the work he had been quietly doing, particularly how he had managed to gather such thorough evidence without drawing attention. Malcolm, always composed, calmly explained his process. He had documented everything meticulously, cross-referencing data and making sure that his findings were indisputable. The board was impressed, though there was an undercurrent of awkwardness in the conversation. After all, Malcolm had exposed not just Greg's personal failings, but also the company's deeper structural problems. The hiring biases, the unchecked authority of senior staff, these were issues that extended far beyond Greg's behavior. It was a reckoning for the company itself, and Malcolm was at the center of it. "We're grateful for what you've done," one of the board members said, his tone cautious. "Your work here is valuable, and we want to ensure that these issues are addressed moving forward." Malcolm nodded, but his face remained impassive. He had heard promises like this before, vague commitments to change, assurances that things would get better, but he knew that real change required more than words. "I appreciate that," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. "But this is bigger than just one person. The company needs to take a hard look at its practices, and that starts with real accountability, not just for Greg, but for the system that allowed him to operate unchecked for so long." The board members exchanged glances, clearly aware of the weight of Malcolm's words. The investigation into Greg was ongoing, and while it was clear that Greg would never return, there were still larger questions to answer. Questions about how someone like Greg had been able to rise to such a position of power and use it to hurt others. "We're committed to making those changes," the board member finally said, though the uncertainty in his voice was apparent. "We'll be in touch as the investigation proceeds." Malcolm stood, shook their hands, and left the meeting. He wasn't satisfied yet. Greg's fall was only part of the equation. There was still work to be done to ensure the company followed through on its promises. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Greg's actions expanded, and the full extent of his misconduct came to light. His misuse of funds, discriminatory hiring practices, and manipulative behavior had all been exposed. The board acted swiftly, terminating Greg's employment permanently and releasing a public statement acknowledging the wrongdoing. The company's image had taken a hit, but it was clear that they were attempting to right their wrongs. For Malcolm, the victory was bittersweet. He had accomplished what he set out to do. He had exposed the corruption, fought back against the injustice, and ensured that Greg would never hurt anyone in the company again. But the process had left him with a deeper understanding of the challenges that still remained. Systemic change wasn't easy, and while Greg was gone, the structures that allowed people like him to thrive were still in place. One afternoon, as Malcolm sat at his desk, he received an unexpected email from Sarah. She had been instrumental in helping him take Greg down, and now she was reaching out with an opportunity. Subject: Senior Management Opportunity. Malcolm, I wanted to reach out to you personally. The board and I have been discussing the future of this company, and we believe you are exactly the kind of leader we need moving forward. If you're interested, we would like to offer you a position in senior management, where you can help us rebuild and reshape the culture here for the better. Please let me know if you'd like to discuss further. Best, Sarah. Malcolm stared at the email for a long time, processing the weight of the offer. It was everything he had worked toward, an opportunity to not only advance his career, but to make real, lasting changes from a position of power. He knew that by accepting this role, he could influence how the company treated its employees, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had experienced under Greg's leadership. But Malcolm wasn't one to rush into decisions. He wanted to be sure that the company was serious about change, that this wasn't just another superficial gesture. After everything he had been through, he had earned the right to be cautious. After a moment, Malcolm smiled to himself and began drafting his response. Sarah, thank you for the offer. I'm open to discussing this further, but only if we can address the deeper issues at play here. I want to ensure that the changes we've talked about actually happen, and that means real commitments, not just in words, but in actions. Let's set up a time to discuss. Best, Malcolm. As he hit send, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He had come a long way, from the humiliating meeting where Greg had tried to belittle him to now being offered a leadership role in the same company. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a new beginning, a chance to reshape the future on his terms. And for Malcolm, that was the most important victory of all.